Welcome back to Sleepy History. Tonight we travel back more than 1,000 years to the cold and rugged lands of Scandinavia, a place of towering mountains, deep forests, icy rivers, and long stretches of coastline where the sea met the sky. As you settle into a comfortable position, imagine yourself standing quietly on the edge of a frozen fjord. The air is crisp and cold. Snowflakes drift slowly from the dark sky. In the distance, a small Viking village rests peacefully beside the water. The year is somewhere in the Viking Age, between the 8th and 11th centuries. Winter has arrived once again. For the people of Scandinavia, winter was not simply a season. It was a test of preparation, patience, and endurance. The Vikings lived in a world very different from our own. There were no electric lights to brighten the darkness, no central heating systems to warm their homes, no supermarkets filled with food. Instead, survival depended on knowledge passed down through generations. The land itself shaped Viking life. Much of Norway was covered by mountains and valleys. Sweden contained vast forests and countless lakes. Denmark, though flatter, still experienced long periods of cold weather during winter. As autumn slowly faded, the days became shorter. Each morning, the sun appeared lower in the sky. Each evening, darkness arrived earlier. For families living in the far north, winter brought an even stranger experience. In some regions, daylight became incredibly brief. The sun barely rose above the horizon before disappearing once again. Imagine waking each day beneath a sky painted in shades of gray and blue. Imagine seeing only a few hours of sunlight before darkness returned. For months at a time, this was reality for many Viking communities. The natural world changed dramatically. Forests became silent. Fields disappeared beneath thick blankets of snow. Rivers slowed beneath layers of ice. The sea itself became more dangerous as winter storms swept across the coastline. Travel became difficult. Farm work nearly stopped. The familiar landscape transformed into a frozen wilderness. Yet, despite these challenges, the Vikings were remarkably skilled at adapting to their environment. They understood that winter would come every year. Because of this, preparation became one of the most important parts of life. Children learned from their parents. Parents learned from their grandparents. Generation after generation, knowledge was carefully preserved. They knew which foods could be stored. They knew how much firewood was needed. They knew how to protect animals during freezing temperatures. And perhaps most importantly, they knew how to remain patient during the long months ahead. Winter demanded respect. The Vikings did not view nature as something to conquer. Instead, they understood that survival depended on working alongside it. The changing seasons controlled nearly every aspect of daily life. A successful harvest during summer could mean comfort during winter. A poor harvest could bring hardship. Every choice mattered. Every resource mattered. Every day of preparation mattered. As darkness settled across the landscape, life gradually moved indoors. The warmth of the Longhouse became increasingly important. Families gathered together near the fire. Stories were shared. Tools were repaired. Plans were made for the months ahead. Outside, icy winds swept across mountains and frozen shorelines. Inside, a different world existed, a world of warmth, family, and tradition. The contrast between these two worlds defined much of Viking winter life. Beyond the villages, the wilderness remained powerful and unpredictable. Wolves moved through snowy forests. Storms crossed the sea. Heavy snowfall sometimes isolated entire communities. Yet these hardships also created resilience. The Vikings became known throughout history for their strength, determination, and ability to adapt. Many of these qualities were shaped by the environment in which they lived. The cold winters taught patience. The difficult conditions taught resourcefulness. The long darkness taught endurance. As another winter settled over Scandinavia, every family understood what lay ahead. Months of cold, months of darkness, months of careful living. But they also understood something else. They had survived before, and they would survive again. The firelight flickered softly inside the Longhouse. The snow continued to fall outside, And across the frozen lands of the north, the story of another Viking winter was just beginning. Part 2. Preparing for winter. As the final weeks of summer faded into autumn, Viking families knew that time was running short, winter was coming, and in the Viking world, winter was not something that could be ignored. It arrived every year with quiet certainty, bringing freezing temperatures, shorter days, and months of difficult living. Because of this, preparation became one of the most important activities of the entire year. For Viking families, the success of winter often depended on the work completed during autumn. Across Scandinavia, villages became busy places, fields needed harvesting, animals required attention, buildings needed repairs, food had to be gathered and preserved. Every member of the household had responsibilities. Men, women, and children all contributed to the preparations. No task was considered unimportant. Every small effort increased the chances of surviving the cold months ahead. One of the first priorities was collecting food. The Vikings understood that fresh food would become difficult to find once snow covered the land. Fields that produced grain during summer would soon become frozen and lifeless. Wild plants would disappear beneath the snow. Travel would become harder. Fishing could become dangerous during winter storms. Because of this, families worked tirelessly to gather as much food as possible before the cold arrived. Barley was among the most important crops. This hardy grain could survive the Scandinavian climate better than many other plants. After harvest, barley was carefully stored for future use. It could be turned into bread, porridge, or other simple meals that helped sustain families throughout winter. Oats were also commonly grown. Like barley, oats provided a valuable source of nutrition during difficult months. Large quantities of grain were stored inside wooden containers and protected from moisture whenever possible. A spoiled food supply could become a serious problem during winter. Storage was just as important as harvesting. Fishing was another critical source of food. The seas surrounding Scandinavia were rich with fish. Throughout autumn, fishermen worked hard to catch as much as they could. Many fish were dried in the open air, others were salted to prevent spoilage. These preservation techniques allowed food to remain edible for long periods of time. Even months later, dried fish could still provide valuable nutrition. Meat was prepared in similar ways. Animals such as sheep, goats, and cattle were important resources. Not every animal could be fed throughout the winter. In some cases, livestock were slaughtered during autumn. The meat was then preserved using salt, drying methods, or smoking techniques. Nothing was wasted. Every piece of food had value. The Vikings understood that careful planning could make the difference between comfort and hardship. While food preparation continued, another equally important task demanded attention: firewood. In a land where temperatures could remain below freezing for extended periods, fire was essential. It provided warmth. It allowed food to be cooked. It created light during long nights. Without enough firewood, winter could become extremely dangerous. Throughout autumn, families spent countless hours gathering wood. Trees were cut down and divided into manageable pieces. Logs were stacked carefully near homes. Large piles of firewood became a common sight throughout Viking villages. The larger the pile, the greater the sense of security. Each log represented another source of warmth during the months ahead. Homes also required preparation. The Viking Longhouse served as the center of family life. Before winter arrived, roofs were inspected for damage. Walls were strengthened. Openings that might allow cold air to enter were repaired whenever possible. Families wanted their homes to remain warm and dry throughout the season. Even small improvements could make a significant difference. A well-maintained longhouse offered protection from wind, snow, and freezing temperatures. Animals required preparation as well. Livestock represented wealth and survival. Cows provided milk. Sheep provided wool. Goats supplied food and other resources. During winter, these animals needed shelter from harsh weather. Additional fodder was gathered and stored. Families ensured that enough food remained available for their animals throughout the cold months. The survival of livestock often influenced the family's future prosperity. Children participated in many of these activities. From an early age, they learned valuable skills. They helped gather supplies. They carried small bundles of wood. They observed older family members and learned how preparation worked. These lessons were important. One day they would be responsible for preparing their own households for winter. Knowledge passed naturally from one generation to the next, as autumn see. Part 3. Food storage and survival. As winter settled across Scandinavia, food became one of the most valuable resources a Viking family possessed. The fields were now hidden beneath snow. The forests offered fewer opportunities for gathering. Storms made travel difficult, and the cold weather limited many daily activities. For this reason, the Vikings spent months preparing food supplies long before winter arrived. Their survival depended on careful planning. Every meal mattered, every stored resource mattered, and every decision made during autumn could influence the family's chances of enduring the long winter season. One of the most important foods in the Viking world was fish. The seas, rivers, and lakes of Scandinavia provided an abundant source of nourishment. Throughout the warmer months, fishermen worked tirelessly. Large catches were brought back to villages and carefully prepared for storage. Many fish were hung on wooden racks and left to dry in the cold northern air. This process removed moisture and helped preserve the food for extended periods. Dried fish could remain edible for many months. Even during the coldest days of winter, it provided a dependable source of nutrition. Salt also played an important role. When available, fish and meat were covered in salt to slow spoilage. This simple technique allowed food to last far longer than fresh supplies. The Vikings understood that preservation was essential. Without it, winter could quickly become dangerous. Meat was another valuable resource. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs were carefully managed throughout the year. As winter approached, some animals were slaughtered. Their meat was preserved through drying, smoking, or salting. Smokehouses became important structures within many communities. Inside these buildings, meat hung above slow-burning fires. The smoke helped protect the food while adding flavor. These preserved foods provided comfort and nourishment during months when fresh meat was difficult to obtain. Grain was equally important. Barley and oats were among the most common crops grown by Viking farmers. After harvest, these grains were carefully stored in containers designed to keep them dry. Moisture was a constant threat. If grain became wet, it could spoil and become unusable. Families inspected storage areas regularly to ensure their precious supplies remained protected. From these grains, simple meals could be prepared throughout winter. Porridge was common. Bread was often baked when resources allowed. Though the meals were simple by modern standards, they provided essential energy during long periods of cold weather. Dairy products also played a role in Viking diets. Milk from cows and goats could be transformed into cheese, butter, and other foods that lasted longer than fresh milk. These products helped provide additional nutrition during winter. In many households, cheese became an important part of daily meals. It stored well and could be consumed gradually over time. The Vikings understood that variety was valuable. Relying on a single food source was risky. A successful winter required multiple supplies working together. Fishing, farming, hunting, and food preservation all contributed to survival. Occasionally, hunting continued during winter. Experienced hunters ventured into snowy forests in search of animals. Deer, elk, and smaller game could provide additional food. However, hunting was never guaranteed. Weather conditions were unpredictable. Animals became more difficult to track, and travel through deep snow required considerable effort. For this reason, stored food remained the foundation of winter survival. Inside Viking homes, meals were often shared around the warmth of a central fire. The fire provided heat, light, and a gathering place for the family. After a long day, sitting beside the flames with a warm meal brought comfort and reassurance. Outside, snowstorms might sweep across the landscape. Cold winds might howl through the darkness. But inside the Longhouse, families found warmth in food, companionship, and tradition. Children learned valuable lessons during these winter evenings. They observed how food was prepared. They listened to stories about previous winters. They learned the importance of planning ahead. Knowledge passed naturally from one generation to the next. Every family carried memories of difficult winters, and every family understood the importance of being prepared. As the months passed, food supplies were carefully monitored. Nothing was wasted. Portions were managed wisely. The Vikings understood that winter could last longer than expected. A family that consumed too much food too quickly might face hardship before spring arrived. Patience and discipline were essential. Fortunately, centuries of experience had taught Viking communities how to survive. Their methods were practical. Their planning was correct. Part 4. Life inside the Longhouse. As winter deepened across Scandinavia, life gradually moved indoors. The fields were frozen, the forests were covered in snow. The sea became rough and unpredictable. For Viking families, the Longhouse became the center of daily life. It was more than a shelter. It was a home, a workplace, a gathering place, and a refuge from the harsh winter world outside. Imagine approaching a Viking longhouse on a cold winter evening. Snow covers the roof. A faint glow shines through small openings. Smoke rises gently into the dark sky. The sound of the wind echoes across the frozen landscape. But as you step inside, everything changes. Warmth replaces the cold. The smell of burning wood fills the air. The soft crackling of a fire creates a sense of comfort and safety. The longhouse was designed to withstand the challenges of the northern climate. Most were built from timber, with walls made from wood and other natural materials. The roofs were often covered with layers of turf or thatch, helping to keep warmth inside during the winter months. The buildings were long and narrow, giving rise to the name Longhouse. Inside, the layout was simple but practical. A large fire burned in the center of the building. This fire was the heart of the home. It provided heat, it provided light, it allowed food to be cooked, and perhaps most importantly, it brought people together. Around the fire, family members gathered throughout the day. They shared meals, they worked on household tasks, they talked about the events of the day, and during the long winter nights, they listened to stories passed down through generations. The fire rarely went out completely. Maintaining warmth was essential. Even a brief loss of heat could make life uncomfortable during freezing temperatures. Someone in the household was usually responsible for tending the fire and ensuring it continued to burn. The smoke from the fire slowly rose toward openings in the roof. Not all of it escaped. As a result, the air inside could often be smoky. To the Vikings, however, this was simply a normal part of daily life. Sleeping arrangements were practical and communal. Rather than separate bedrooms, family members often slept along raised platforms built beside the walls. These sleeping areas were covered with animal skins, wool blankets, and other materials that provided insulation against the cold. Families slept close together. Body heat helped keep everyone warm during the coldest nights. Outside, snowstorms might rage across the countryside. Inside, the family remained protected. Animals sometimes shared portions of the building as well. Certain livestock could be kept close to the family during winter. Their presence provided additional warmth and protection. Although this arrangement may seem unusual today, it was an effective solution in a harsh environment. Daily life inside the longhouse remained surprisingly busy. Winter was not simply a season of waiting. There was always work to do. Clothing needed repair, tools required maintenance, fishing nets had to be checked and mended, woodworking projects continued. Women often spent many hours spinning wool and weaving fabric. Warm clothing was essential for survival. Creating and repairing garments was therefore an important responsibility. The soft sound of spinning and weaving became a familiar part of winter life. Men also remained active. Weapons were maintained, tools were sharpened, plans were made for future journeys and farming activities once spring returned. Even during winter, preparation for the future never stopped. Children learned by observing the adults around them. Every task became an opportunity to gain knowledge. A young child watching a parent repair clothing or carve wood was learning skills that would one day become valuable. Education happened naturally through daily life. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next. As darkness settled outside, evenings became especially important. Winter nights were long. In some northern regions, darkness seemed endless. Without modern entertainment, Viking families relied on conversation, storytelling, music, and shared experiences. The glow of the fire transformed the Longhouse into a peaceful gathering place. Stories filled the air. Some were tales of ancestors, others spoke of distant lands and great adventures. Some were simple family memories. These moments strengthened the bonds between family members. They created a sense of connection and belonging. The Longhouse became more than a physical structure. It became the center of Viking identity and community. Within its walls, people found comfort during difficult times. They found warmth during freezing nights. And they found companionship during months of darkness. Outside, winter continued its relentless march across Scandinavia. The snow grew deeper, the winds grew strong. Part 5. Family Life. During winter, as winter settled firmly across the Scandinavian landscape, family life became more important than ever. The long days of farming had passed. The harvest had been gathered, the animals had been sheltered. And now, for many Viking families, life centered around the warmth and security of the home. Winter was a season of togetherness. While the outside world became cold, dark, and often unforgiving, the Longhouse remained a place of comfort and companionship. Families spent more time together than at any other period of the year. Parents, children, grandparents, and relatives shared the same living space. Everyday life unfolded around the central fire. The fire provided warmth, but it also brought people together. Meals were prepared and shared, stories were exchanged, lessons were taught, and memories were created. For Viking children, winter was a season of learning. Without modern schools, education came directly from family members. Parents taught practical skills. Grandparents shared knowledge gathered over decades of experience. Children learned how to survive in the challenging northern environment. Young boys often observed their fathers repairing tools, carving wood, or maintaining equipment. They learned patience, they learned responsibility, and they learned the importance of hard work. Young girls frequently learned spinning, weaving, sewing, and other household skills from their mothers and grandmothers. These abilities were essential in Viking society. Warm clothing was necessary for survival. Every family depended on these skills. Learning began at an early age. Knowledge was considered one of the family's most valuable possessions. Winter evenings provided the perfect opportunity for teaching. Outside, darkness covered the land. Inside, the firelight illuminated faces as stories and lessons were shared. Many of these lessons were practical: how to prepare food, how to care for animals, how to recognize changes in weather, how to use resources wisely. Every skill increased the likelihood of survival. Family members relied on one another. Cooperation was essential. No individual could easily face the challenges of winter alone. Working together made life safer and more comfortable. This spirit of cooperation extended beyond the immediate family. Neighbors often helped one another during difficult times. If a family faced shortages or hardships, nearby households sometimes offered assistance. Strong communities increased everyone's chances of surviving the season. Winter strengthened social bonds. People spent more time talking and sharing experiences. Friendships deepened. Families grew closer. The long nights encouraged conversation and reflection. Without the distractions of constant travel or agricultural work, people had time to connect with one another. These relationships formed the foundation of Viking society. Respect for elders was particularly important. Older family members possessed valuable knowledge. They remembered previous winters, they understood local conditions, and they carried stories that connected younger generations to the past. Their wisdom was highly respected. Children often listened carefully as elders described historic events, family traditions, and lessons learned from experience. The passing of knowledge helped preserve Viking culture across generations. Meals remained an important part of daily life. Though winter food was often simple, shared meals created a sense of unity. Families gathered around the fire to eat together. These moments provided both nourishment and comfort. The act of sharing food reinforced the idea that survival was a collective effort. Everyone contributed, everyone benefited, everyone belonged. The atmosphere inside the Longhouse could be surprisingly peaceful. The fire crackled softly, the wind howled outside, snow drifted across the landscape. Yet within the shelter of the home, life continued steadily. People worked on small projects, children played simple games, clothing was repaired, tools were maintained, and conversations filled the room. Music sometimes accompanied these gatherings. Simple instruments and songs provided entertainment during long evenings. Music helped pass the time. It also strengthened social connections. Like storytelling, music brought people together. Laughter and shared experiences helped make winter more bearable. Despite the challenges of the season, many families likely found comfort in these moments. Winter was difficult, but it also offered opportunities to slow down and focus on relationships. In a world where survival often required constant effort, these quiet evenings became valuable. The Longhouse became more than a shelter. It became a place where family identity was strengthened, a place where traditions were preserved, a place where children learned what it meant to be. Part 6. Stories, Myths, and Gods. As the winter nights grew longer and darkness settled across the Scandinavian landscape, storytelling became one of the most treasured parts of Viking life. Outside, cold winds swept across frozen fields and snow-covered forests. Inside the Longhouse, families gathered around the warmth of the fire. The flames flickered softly, shadows danced across the wooden walls. And as the evening grew quiet, stories began to fill the room. For the Vikings, storytelling was much more than entertainment. It was a way of preserving history, it was a way of teaching important lessons, and it was a way of passing knowledge from one generation to the next. Long before books became common, stories helped keep traditions alive. Children listened carefully, adults remembered familiar tales, and elders shared wisdom gained through years of experience. Some stories were based on real events. They told of famous ancestors, distant voyages, and brave warriors. These tales reminded listeners of the achievements and struggles of those who came before them. Other stories belonged to the world of myth and legend. These were the stories that captured the imagination. Stories of gods, giants, magical creatures, and extraordinary adventures. Among the most important figures in Viking mythology was Odin. Odin was often described as the wise and powerful ruler of the gods. He was associated with knowledge, wisdom, poetry, and mystery. According to legend, Odin sacrificed greatly in his search for understanding. He was willing to endure hardship in order to gain wisdom. For many Vikings, Odin represented the pursuit of knowledge and insight. Another beloved figure was Thor. Thor was known as the god of thunder. He carried a powerful hammer called Mjolnir. In countless stories, Thor defended both gods and humans from dangerous enemies. He was strong, courageous, and determined. His adventures became some of the most popular tales shared during winter evenings. Children likely listened with excitement as storytellers described Thor's battles against giants and other powerful beings. The Vikings also told stories about Loki. Unlike Thor and Odin, Loki was often unpredictable. He was clever, mischievous, and sometimes caused great trouble. Yet his actions frequently led to unexpected adventures. Stories involving Loki often contained surprises and lessons about the consequences of deception and selfishness. These myths formed an important part of Viking culture. They helped explain the world around them. Thunderstorms could be linked to Thor. Wisdom could be associated with Odin. Natural events often became connected to the actions of gods and mythical beings. In a world where many mysteries remained unexplained, mythology provided meaning and understanding. Winter nights were the perfect time for these stories. The darkness outside created an atmosphere that encouraged imagination. The warmth of the fire made people feel safe and comfortable. As snow drifted quietly across the landscape, listeners could picture distant worlds filled with heroes, monsters, and magical realms. Storytelling brought people together. It created shared experiences. It strengthened family bonds, and it preserved cultural traditions. The stories were not always dramatic or heroic. Some were humorous, some taught practical lessons, others explained family history. Each story served a purpose. Each story helped connect the community. Music sometimes accompanied these gatherings. Simple songs and poems were performed alongside spoken stories. Skilled storytellers could captivate an audience for hours. Their voices carried listeners into distant lands and ancient times. In many ways, they served as both entertainers and teachers. Children learned important values through these stories: courage, loyalty, wisdom, respect, patience. The lessons were woven naturally into the tales. Rather than simply telling children what was right or wrong, stories allowed them to discover these lessons for themselves. As generations passed, these traditions continued. Parents shared stories with their children. Those children eventually became parents themselves, and the stories survived. Even today, many Viking myths remain known around the world. Thousands of years later, people still recognize the names Odin, Thor, and Loki. Their stories continue to inspire books, films, and works of art. But during the Viking Age, these tales served a more personal purpose. They brought comfort during long winters. They provided entertainment when daylight was scarce. And they reminded people that they belonged to a larger cultural tradition. As another winter evening drew to a close, the fire burned low. The storyteller's voice grew softer. Children became sleepy. The room grew quiet. Outside, snow continued to fall beneath the dark northern sky. Inside, the final words of an ancient. Part 7. The Return of Spring. After many long weeks of darkness, cold winds, and snow-covered landscapes, a subtle change began to appear across the Viking world. At first, it was almost impossible to notice. The morning seemed slightly brighter. The sun lingered a little longer above the horizon. The air, though still cold, carried the first hints of change. Winter was slowly releasing its grip on the land. For Viking families, this was a welcome sight. They had endured months of careful living. They had relied on stored food. They had gathered around their fires. They had faced storms, darkness, and freezing temperatures. Now, at last, signs of spring were beginning to emerge. The transformation did not happen overnight. Snow remained across the landscape. Ice still covered many rivers and lakes. But day by day, the power of the sun grew stronger. Small streams began to flow once again. Icicles hanging from rooftops slowly melted. Patches of earth appeared where snow had once covered everything. For many Vikings, these changes brought a sense of hope and relief. The return of sunlight was more than a seasonal event. It represented survival. Every family that reached spring had successfully endured another northern winter. The long months of preparation had proven worthwhile. The food stores had lasted. The Longhouse had provided shelter. The community had remained strong. Now attention gradually shifted toward the future. Animals became more active. Livestock that had spent months sheltered from the cold could soon return to open fields. Birds began to appear in greater numbers. Their songs filled the air once again. The silence of winter slowly faded. Nature was awakening. Across the countryside, signs of life became increasingly visible. The first green shoots emerged from the soil. Trees prepared to grow new leaves. The landscape that had appeared frozen and lifeless slowly transformed into something vibrant and alive. For Viking farmers, spring marked the beginning of another busy season. Fields needed attention. Tools had to be prepared. Plans made during winter would soon become reality. Seeds would be planted. Animals would be cared for. Work that had paused during the cold months would begin again. The cycle of life continued. This rhythm of the seasons shaped Viking society. Each year followed a familiar pattern. Summer brought growth. Autumn brought preparation. Winter demanded endurance. And spring brought renewal. Generations of Vikings lived according to this cycle. It influenced their work, their traditions, and their understanding of the world. As daylight increased, daily life changed as well. People spent more time outdoors. Travel became easier. Trade routes reopened. Fishing became safer as storms became less frequent. Communities that had spent much of winter focused on survival could now look outward once again. Opportunities returned with the warmer weather. The arrival of spring was often accompanied by a feeling of optimism. The hardships of winter began to fade into memory. Families could focus on new goals, new harvests, new journeys, new possibilities. Children who had spent months inside the Longhouse could run and play outdoors once again. The fresh air and open spaces brought excitement after a season spent largely indoors. Even the atmosphere within villages seemed different. Where winter had encouraged quiet reflection, spring encouraged activity and movement. The sounds of work returned, the sounds of animals, the sounds of people preparing for another year. Yet despite their excitement for the future, the Vikings never forgot the lessons of winter. Each season taught valuable knowledge, patience, preparation, resilience, cooperation. These qualities helped communities survive not only winter but many other challenges as well. The experience of enduring difficult months together strengthened families and villages. As another spring morning arrived, sunlight reflected across the waters of a Scandinavian fjord. The snow continued to melt. Birds crossed the brightening sky. A gentle breeze moved through the valley. And in a nearby Viking village, life began once more. The fires still burned within the longhouses. But now the doors opened more often. People stepped outside. The world felt larger again. Winter had passed. The land was awakening. And another chapter of Viking life was beginning. As we leave this peaceful village behind, we can imagine the generations of people who lived here long ago. People who faced winter with courage, who prepared carefully, who worked together, and who found warmth and comfort even during the coldest months of the year. Their world was challenging, yet it was also filled with resilience, tradition, and hope. The snow has melted, the days have grown longer, and spring has returned once again. Thank you for joining Sleepy History on this